And we're back for the regularly scheduled NHL Power Rankings Week 10 edition. And this week, not to bury the lead too much, but it is the same top 10 teams in the top 10, although there are some movers, especially towards the bottom of the list. And we also have one new team as an honorable mention that I don't think has been mentioned yet in these power rankings. Either way, let's just get right into it. Starting with that first honorable mention, and a team that's not necessarily particularly close to being in the top 10. They would need a couple more hot weeks, but the way they've been going, that might actually be possible, to the surprise of many people, including I think a lot of their fans, that being the Nashville Predators. And actually with the Predators, they are the only team that I'm going to mention in this video that played at least 3 games this week and won all of them. Not to mention that they are also the team with the longest current winning streak in the NHL at 4 games now. And it's not just that they've been playing easy teams here over the last week plus. In fact, all 3 of the teams that they played this week in those 3 wins in Philadelphia, Carolina, and DC are all currently above 500. And for that matter, the team that they beat to start that winning streak at the end of last week would be the Canadiens, who are currently sitting at NHL 500. Even if it is somewhat surprising that they're there. And actually, for that matter, they've won 7 of their last 8 games, with their only loss here over the last 2.5 weeks has been a 4-0 shutout at the hand of the Toronto Maple Leafs, who we will be getting to on this list. And for Nashville, the schedule doesn't get much easier here over the next week, as in the next 3 games, they've got Vancouver, Philadelphia again, and then Dallas. So if they are able to keep this winning streak going through this next week, that would be a pretty impressive stretch from this team if it isn't already. And speaking of teams that at least I certainly did not expect to be mentioning when it came to talking about top 10 teams in the NHL this deep into the season, or at least close to the top 10, with the second honorable mention, I do have the Philadelphia Flyers, who have continued to win more games than they lose. In fact, this last week, the only game they lost was in overtime to those Nashville Predators. And maybe even more surprisingly with the Flyers, the way that they've been able to get to this point is largely by being one of the better teams in the NHL at keeping the puck out of their own net, which has been a bit of an issue for this team over the last few years, and it's still not necessarily thanks to a complete turnaround in net, although things have been better there as well. It's largely been thanks to a very good defensive scheme that has been making the work easier on the goaltending, and certainly been doing a good portion of the work for this team to get them to where they're at in the standings, currently sitting second in the Metro Division under, well, the Rangers team that has been sitting atop these power rankings for quite a while now. Moving on then into the top 10, we start in the 10th spot with the Dallas Stars, who moved down from 9th last week, and that's largely because they just get passed by other teams. They only played 2 games this week. Both were close, a 5-4 win over the Senators, and then a 4-3 loss in overtime to the Blues. So 3 points in 2 games is certainly not a bad week for the Stars, but it also wasn't a fantastic week either. I mean, it's only 1 point short of perfect, but they didn't play the toughest opponents. Both the Blues and Senators have been struggling of late, and both were close games. In fact, they managed to lose the overtime one to the Blues. So certainly not the most convincing game, and that's even with a team that has still been playing very well defensively and started to pick up that scoring, or I should say the scoring has continued to trend upwards as they're now towards the top of the league in goals for per game. And as far as that's concerned, another 8 goals in 2 games this week, so that is still going well. But the goaltending has been shaky at best for the Stars, and certainly not what they were getting early on in the season from Ottinger, who has not necessarily been bad, but certainly not the goaltender that they've come to expect in Dallas. It's probably why they started Wedgwood in both of the games this week, and it really didn't go that much better. Wedgwood's stats are about the same, if not slightly worse than Ottinger's. He has a actually slightly better save percentage, but definitely worse when it comes to goals against average per game, and also certainly worse when it comes to goals saved above expected. Up next in the 9th spot, and dropping 4 places from last week, I have the Florida Panthers, who did not have a particularly great week. They finished it off strong with a 5-1 win over the Oilers, but they started it off with back-to-back shutout losses, 4-0 in each occasion, to the Seattle Kraken and Vancouver Canucks, which the Canucks one is a little bit more understandable. 4-0 shutout is still not great no matter who you're playing, but the loss to the Kraken is certainly one that stands out a little bit more. Now, the Kraken have been playing a little bit more like the team we expected, and certainly I hoped for coming into this season over these last few games, but that did kind of start with that game against the Panthers. And for the Panthers, it's a very good thing that even after those 2 games against Seattle and Vancouver, they're still in the top 5 in goals against per game, being able to keep the puck out of their net more than just about any other team in the NHL, thanks to still solid goaltending from Bobrovsky and good defensive play. Because if it wasn't for that, as well as the goal scoring that they're getting out of Reinhart, Verhaeghe, and Barkov, this team would be in a lot of trouble, as those three are pretty much solo carrying, or I guess tri-carrying. The three of them are pretty much the entire offense of this team, and it has to be getting pretty concerning now that Tkachuk has not gotten things going, still sitting on just 5 goals on the season, and sure, he does have 21 points with 16 assists, but that's definitely a guy that you want to be up there with those other three when it comes to putting the puck in the net himself. Now, we still do have about 2/3 of the season remaining for him to get things going, but for the Panthers, they need someone to start scoring a little bit more other than those three, because especially if they were to lose one of those three, it would put them in a pretty tenuous situation on the offensive end, and even as good as they've been defensively, if they can't score goals, it's gonna be hard to win enough games to keep things going at the rate they have. In the 8th spot and moving down 1 from last week, I have the Colorado Avalanche, who, like the Panthers, have not played a close game for a little while now, as they start off their week blowing out the Sabres 5-1, then get blown out 6-2 at the hands of the Winnipeg Jets, and then finish their week strong, blowing out the San Jose Sharks, who have been a lot better of late, but it still is the Sharks, and that's not a roster that should be playing as well as they have over the last couple of weeks now. Which I don't say in any way to take anything away from what the Sharks have been able to do here of late. If anything, it's a credit to the Sharks that they've been playing as well as they have with the roster talent that they have. Really, I more meant to bring that up as a way of saying that the comparison between the Avalanche roster and the Sharks roster talent-wise should probably lead to the expectation of something along the lines of a 6-1 win. So yes, the Avalanche did still move down 1 this week, even with 2 pretty dominant wins, and still sitting points-wise at least on top of the Central Division. But I couldn't really have them above the team that's currently right below them in the Central, in the Winnipeg Jets, considering now over the last 2 weeks, they've lost to that Jets team twice, by a combined score of 10-4, which is not particularly confidence-inspiring, especially when you consider that it's not just the Jets that the Avalanche have had trouble with here over this last stretch. Because although they have been picking up their wins here and there over the last couple of weeks, and when they do win, they do it pretty decisively, they haven't beaten a team that's currently above NHL 500 since way back on November 27th against the Lightning. And they haven't beaten a team that's over real 500, having won more games than they've lost, since the 22nd of November against the Canucks. Though for what it's worth, at least the good news for the Avalanche in that way is that 4 of their next 6 games through the end of the season do come against teams that are currently under NHL 500, and a couple of them pretty well under NHL 500. But it could make the back-to-back games coming up here against the Arizona Coyotes pretty interesting ones right around Christmas. And then in the 7th spot, and moving up 3 spots from last week, I even considered moving them up farther than that, I have the Toronto Maple Leafs. Now, for the Maple Leafs, it hasn't always been pretty. It's pretty well documented that they continue to find new and creative ways to get to extra hockey, either overtime or the shootout, and when it comes to that, they have started to lose more of those opportunities than not, but they also have started to pick up more regular and pretty decisive wins, especially this week, with a 7-3 win over a good Rangers team, and then a 7-0 shutout domination of their old GM's team in the Pittsburgh Penguins. And I suppose for what it's worth, their creative way of finding overtime the one time this week was in the form of a 5-0 comeback in the 3rd period all by itself, but they still lost 6-5 in overtime to the Columbus Blue Jackets, which is not necessarily a quality loss, but they still at least get the 1 point out of it. Now, of course, as it always seems to be, the focus of late in Leafland has been on goaltending, and I suppose rightly so with Wool going out a couple weeks ago, and in his place, Samsonov has been a little here, little there, and the last couple of games have been a bit tough, but in 3 starts for the Leafs, Martin Jones is 3-0, and I can tell you from experience with watching Jones last year, this is a very Martin Jones stat. The Leafs have now 18 goals in those 3 games. For whatever reason, going back to the start of last season, the teams that play in front of Jones seem to score a lot better when he's in net. But it's not just goaltending depth that's been showing up here of late for Toronto. They've definitely been getting that from their defensive end, where they are certainly not healthy. And although they're a lot more healthy on the offensive end, their depth scoring has really started to show up, and it's not all on that top 4 or the big 4 to do all of the scoring for this team. And if they can continue to get those contributions from throughout the lineup, this is a team that's going to have a lot of success and should still be very much in the hunt for one of the top seeds in the East once Wool gets back and hopefully gets back to his previous injury form. Or before injury form, however you want to say that. Moving on though to the 6th spot, I have another Canadian team in the Winnipeg Jets. Now, for the Jets, like I already pointed out, this is a team that although they are currently sitting second in their division in the Central, they have really handled the team that sits one above them in the Colorado Avalanche in both of their recent matchups with them. And yes, I'm well aware that they did start their week off by losing 2-1 to the Sharks, but again, the Sharks were hot at the time, and while I'm not going to fully excuse that, it's certainly more excusable when it's followed up with not just dominating the Avalanche 6-2, but also handling the LA Kings 5-2. So that's two pretty decisive wins against two of the best teams in the NHL. Or certainly one of the best teams in the NHL in the Kings, and one of the best rosters in the Avalanche. And obviously, it certainly helps for the Jets that they continue to be exceptional at keeping the puck out of their own net, now having given up 2 or fewer goals in 7 consecutive games. But it's extra impressive that these last 2 wins against the Kings and Avalanche that they scored 11 goals in came without their leading goal scorer in Kyle Connor. Now, obviously, his stint on the IR will still be something to watch with this team going forward if they can continue to get that goal production, but it's a promising start, and if they can continue to keep the puck out of their own net at that rate, they might only need 2 or 3 goals a game in order to keep getting wins until eventually he can hopefully get back. So obviously, outside of injuries, things are going pretty well in Winnipeg at the moment. If there was one thing that could certainly use some improvement, it would definitely be the special teams, where on both sides, they are towards the bottom of the league. Their penalty kill is among the league's worst, and the power play is very near the bottom third. But even with that, they're still picking up wins at a good enough rate that they should have no trouble making the playoffs, especially with the divide between the top 3 in each of the divisions of the West and the rest of the pack. And we'll continue to stay north of the border as we move to 5th place in the Vancouver Canucks. Now, the Canucks continue to be a team that is not necessarily loved by most of the advanced stats, especially not the 5-on-5 expected goals for and against, and they are still somehow offensively being upheld and maintaining a 13.3 shooting percentage, which definitely doesn't seem sustainable, but they're somehow still there a third of the way through the season, well above the rest of the NHL when it comes to that. Even second place is more in the 11% range. But no matter how they're doing it, they continue to pick up wins, and at the end of the day, that's all that really matters. Of course, part of it, and a big part of it, is certainly Thatcher Demko's performance. He had another fantastic week this week, giving up just 5 goals in 4 games. 3 of them actually coming in the last game, so he gave up just 2 over the stretch of 3 games. They do lose the one game this week, 2-1 in a shootout to Minnesota, so it looks like a 2 in the score column, but he only gave up 1 goal during actual hockey play. So if Demko keeps playing that way that he has been, it might not even matter if the Canucks do start to regress back to the mean a little bit and some more normalcy when it comes to especially that shooting percentage, and back to kind of the way they have been playing when it comes to the expected goals, especially considering even outside of their overall team shooting percentage, they do have 5 starting forwards all above 20% shooting percentage, and their leading goal scorer in Besser is above 25 shooting percentage. None of which seems particularly sustainable over the course of a full season. But again, even if it's not, they're keeping the puck out of their own net so well that it might not matter if they do start to score a goal or 2 less here and there. And heck, even if it does start to matter and they do start to lose a little bit more frequently than they have to this point, well, they've already picked up the 2nd most points in the NHL at this point in time, and sure, most teams have games in hand on them, but those points won't come out of the standings, so they are probably a playoff destined team regardless of what happens the rest of the way. Or who knows, maybe they'll just keep this up the rest of the way, and if that's the case, they could end up challenging the team I have in 4th place for the win in the Pacific Division. Of course, that being the Vegas Golden Knights. And honestly, I might have the Golden Knights too low on this list at 4. But it is losses like the one they had in the middle this week, 5-2 the Buffalo Sabres, that make me question how high I want to move them up. Even still, they are tied with the Philadelphia Flyers for the best last 10 game stretch at 7-1-2, having picked up points in 9 of their last 10 games. It does seem like the Golden Knights are pretty much fully back, even if it took them until overtime to beat the Flames, but they did absolutely stomp the Senators here on Sunday. Now, it is true that they, like the Canucks, have been at least potentially overachieving how they've actually been playing, certainly not to the same extent as the Canucks. They have at least a reasonable shooting percentage, right around 10%, and they are at least on the right side of NHL average when it comes to both expected goals for and expected goals against at 5-on-5. Though again, like with Vancouver and Demko, a good part of that overachieving that Vegas has had could very well be the goaltending that they've been getting. And for a long time, that was Hill and Thompson as a tandem, but since Hill's been out for pretty much all of December now, Thompson has picked up right where they left off as the two of them and just continued doing it pretty much all himself. And also, just like everything I said about Vancouver, even if Vegas is overachieving a little bit, it really doesn't matter because they do have the most points in the standings at this point in the season. And even if that is partially because they played the most games, those points aren't coming out of the standings, regardless of how things go the rest of the way for Vegas this season. And speaking of teams that just continue to find ways to get points in the standings where it matters most, in third, I still have the Boston Bruins. Now, for the Bruins, it has been a shaky last couple of weeks, and they are getting very close if this continues to starting to move down this list at least a little bit. But for now, they have one of the best points percentages in the NHL, and even if they have been losing every other game, they've been losing at least over this last week in overtime rather than in regulation, and at least picking up those loser points. And for what it's worth, which I do think is something, those 2 overtime losses they had this week did come to pretty good opponents in the New Jersey Devils, who have been surging of late, outside of this game on Sunday that they lost 5-1 to the Anaheim Ducks, and also the New York Rangers. And sure, Boston's one win this week did come in the shootout, so it's not the most convincing win ever. But again, that is 4 points in 3 games, which is enough to continue to chug along at the top of the Atlantic Division, even with Toronto also picking up points in most of the games they've been playing, having gone to overtime quite a bit themselves. Now, I will say that the goal scoring for the Bruins, or lack thereof, certainly consistently anyway, is definitely starting to become a bit of a concern as they have now been limited to just 1 goal in 3 of their last 5 games. And if that continues, there's no doubt that they will start to slip in these power rankings and probably even the standings. And for that matter, I really wouldn't put up too much of an argument if you told me that you think I have the Bruins too high at this point. It certainly hasn't been the most convincing last couple of weeks for them. But at least for me, I do base these power rankings off of not just what happened in the last week, but what's happened this whole season. And they did have that incredible start to the season that still has them as one of the best teams in the NHL by record, which, regardless of how they get to that record, is the most important thing. Again, it's not the whole equation, but it is a big part of it. And speaking of teams that are high on this list and did not have particularly convincing weeks, in second, I still have the LA Kings, who did just play the 2 games, and that might have been for the best for them, as they do lose 5-2 to Winnipeg in the first game, and then go all the way to round 9 of the shootout against Seattle, winning that one 3-2. And that win in the shootout did break a 3-game losing streak for the Kings, which is nice. This is a team that certainly has had the gap close on them. I mean, the Bruins and the Kings kind of stayed where they were pretty close to each other, but the Bruins and Kings have definitely had that gap close up behind them from Vegas and Vancouver. So even though things do look pretty similar at the top of this list this week from last week, depending on how things go this next week, we could see quite a bit of movement in this top 5. And at least for the Kings, although they are behind both Vancouver and Vegas in the standings, they do have 5 games in hand with both of those teams. And like I've said for a couple weeks running now, this is, even in spite of their recent struggles in winning games, still the best team in the NHL when it comes to expected stats at 5-on-5. Of course, they have slipped there a little bit, allowing Carolina of all teams to catch up to them, which is a team that's had trouble turning that performance into actual points in the standings. And for that matter, Edmonton has kind of taken off with things when it comes to expected goals for per game, as you kind of expect from Edmonton. It was just, I mean, I think everyone was pretty baffled by the fact that they started the season the way they did. And now, obviously, they've surged right back to around NHL 500, and who knows, they could find their way into this top 10 if things keep going that way. Probably still will take until middle of January for that to happen, but yeah, the Oilers coming on strong. Anyway, this is supposed to be about the Kings, so for the Kings, obviously, again, to this point in the season, things have been going pretty well for them with their lighter schedule to start off the year for the first couple of months. They've been, again, one of the best teams in the NHL at 5-on-5, with that suffocating play in the neutral zone that doesn't allow teams to get much going offensively, and then especially helped out by the emergence of Byfield, they're very good in the offensive end as well. Plus, the incredible season from Talbot has certainly helped put a good backstop to all of it. It has helped in that way, though, to have Copley able to spell Talbot here and there, and not put everything on Talbot as an everyday starter. But now, with Copley going to the IR, and the schedule likely to get heavier here for the Kings over the next couple of months, whether or not Talbot can hold up to being an everyday starter, or if the Kings can find another backup that can spell him as well as Copley had been for the last few weeks anyway, is a question that will remain here for the remainder of the season. At least for now, though, Talbot has proven everybody wrong that expected that to be a weakness for this team coming into the season. So until he proves that, well, until he just falls off a cliff, I'm going to continue to believe that he can continue to be that goaltender that we've seen for the Kings this season. So then, to round things out once again for another week in first place, I have the New York Rangers, who for a second week running start out their week with a very questionable game that makes it look like they're trying to work their way out of this top spot as they lose 7-3 to the Toronto Maple Leafs. But they do follow it up with 2 wins to finish off the week, 5-1 against a terrible Ducks team that's been really bad of late, even with their 5-1 win over New Jersey here on Sunday. And then they do beat Boston 2-1 in overtime, which does also help keep them in this first place and not have Boston jump up into this potential top spot once again. Even with the Rangers retaining this top spot for yet another week, though, it is starting to look like a bit of a vulnerable top spot. And sure, they have now beaten the teams in second and third on this list in consecutive weeks, but the goal scoring for the Rangers has been inconsistent to say the least. Now, obviously, that's something that maybe you could have seen coming based on the advanced stats, where they are now above NHL average when it comes to expected goals for, just barely, but above it, and that wasn't something that was true a few weeks ago, but it has started to slow down, and, I mean, the Anaheim game aside, 5-1 there, they are struggling to score more than 1 or 2 goals a game. Now, the good news, of course, is that at the other end of the ice, outside of the Toronto game, they have been pretty good at keeping the puck out of their own net as well, which certainly helps keep them in games and allow them to get those wins off of the one extra mistake that they're able to take advantage of. But it could make these next couple of games against Toronto again, and then Edmonton, pretty interesting ones for how this top 5 looks come this time next week. But with all that said, as always, I'd love to know your thoughts down in the comment section below, what your top 10 would look like, what teams you think I have too high, too low, things that I've forgotten completely that you think should have been mentioned here in this top 10 video. Obviously, I can't get to everything, and I, unfortunately, like the hockey guy, don't quite have the time to watch every game, so I'm sure there's some details here and there that you could enlighten me to down in the comments. But until next week, or next time another Kraken video comes out if you are here for the R&Rs as well. But either way, as always, thank you very much for getting to this point if you have. If you did like or enjoy this video, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below to help support the channel, the like and subscribe, of course. And until next time, stay safe out there, be good to each other, God bless, and go Kraken, who are finally starting to get some wins. They're going to need a lot more wins if they want to be a part of this top 10, but they're at least getting wins.